Driving north to Cincinnati on Interstate 75 is fairly uneventful. A long stretch of highway dotted by rest stops and quaint tourist attractions. There are road signs for the Ark Encounter, but nothing that would indicate its sheer scale or even what it is. When passing through Williamstown, Kentucky, the Ark can be seen in the distance across the rolling hills. It's difficult to determine the exact size from this angle, but the boat seems impossibly large, particularly compared to the nearby buildings. As you grow closer, it continues to get larger and larger, looming over the landscape of the small town that surrounds it. Initial advertising and impressions of the Ark Encounter seem more like a theme park than a religious location, with a zip line, petting zoo, and several gift shops. However, the Ark building itself presents a strictly religious narrative driven by terrifying apocalyptic themes and meticulously crafted, historically accurate museum exhibits. This dichotomy between entertainment and apocalypticism may seem irresolvable, but it is expertly weaved into the experience of the Ark Encounter to create a storyline for visitors. The Ark Encounter project was developed by Answers in Genesis, a Christian evangelical organization which focuses on education efforts via museums and media publication. More specifically, Answers in Genesis focuses on fundamentalism and biblical literalism, purporting the creationist idea that the earth is only 6,000 years old. In many ways, the Ark Encounter is the actualization of this belief, serving to prove that the flood described in the biblical book of Genesis, quote, was a real historical event with geologic and biological implications. The Ark Encounter has received a lot of attention for its lofty goal, which many have criticized for being politicized, an inaccurate interpretation of the Bible, and pseudoscientific. On YouTube, it's fairly easy to find inflammatory critiques of the Ark Encounter. I just want to clarify that I'm not here to argue with the actual belief system of the Ark Encounter, but rather to discuss the way that the Ark Encounter operates within American culture and history as a religious site. That's not to say I'm not going to make critiques of the Ark Encounter and Answers in Genesis, but that isn't my goal. Many people's initial impression of the Ark Encounter is that it's just some pseudoscientific propaganda. But to say that is a disservice to the actual cultural impact of the location as a whole. The Ark Encounter presents a uniquely evangelical history of the Bible and creates a site of pilgrimage and reconversion in an isolationist society that finds itself culturally, physically, and religiously removed from the ancient origins of Christianity. Before we begin, I should introduce myself. My name is Megan, and I am in my senior year of undergrad at the University of Iowa, majoring in religious studies, history, and ancient civilizations. My focus within all of that is tourism and religion in modern America. The Ark Encounter stands out to me as a perfect amalgamation of everything that I love about American religion, and it's an utterly fascinating rabbit hole. So this project has been the culmination of about 9 months of effort so far, and it's certainly not the last that you're going to hear from me on the subject, because it goes deeper than I could even go in this video. That's enough about me for now, though. Let's start by taking a large step backwards into the development of religion in the Americas. Then we'll discuss my personal experiences at the Ark Encounter, some of my observations there, and finally we'll discuss kind of the nitty-gritty of why all of this matters at all. All of our major topics will be time-stamped in the description so that you can jump around if necessary, though I do encourage you to watch everything so you can get the best experience. And because I worked really hard on it, and I'll be really sad if you skip it. So, religious tourism has always been around in the form of pilgrimage, or the act of taking an intentional, often perilous, journey to a location of religious significance. In Christianity, these locations tend to be tied to historical figures, either found in the Bible or within the cult of saints, places that Jesus, the apostles, or Mother Mary might have stood. Christian pilgrimage, as we think of it today, gained massive popularity in mid to late medieval Europe, where it took off not only as an activity, but as a form of business for churches. It's also important to note that there is an emphasis in pilgrimage not just upon the destination, but the specific route that the pilgrim is taking. While arriving at the religious site allows the pilgrim to experience some kind of actualization, the journey itself serves as a meditative experience. At times, the journey was incredibly perilous, which was a sign of the individual's willingness to test the limits of their faith. Similarly, evangelizing efforts during the late medieval and early modern era took these journeys as a sign of devotion, which encouraged Christians to venture into far-off lands akin to the Book of Acts. The colonization of the Americas brought Christians further from their religious centers than they had ever gone before, and it was clear that religious traditions such as pilgrimage would need to be adapted to the newly discovered continent. It was necessary for religious authorities to establish America itself as a holy land, in lieu of a Christian precedent for the area such as those in Jerusalem or Rome. This was a time of extreme religious transformation, not just for the physical land of America, but for the indigenous people who already lived there. Catholic adaptation of America was cemented with the Marian apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, a series of visions of Mary that appeared to the native Nahua man Juan Diego. This not only established a shrine that many could visit by a pilgrimage, but it sanctified modern Mexico and showed religious fervor within Christian converts. Of course, in a description of pilgrimage, we can't gloss over the American pilgrims. If you went through the American public school system, you are tired of hearing the story. But I promise I will keep it short and specific. The Pilgrims are an extremely famous group of settlers who came to America on the Mayflower. They are often conflated with another settling group, the Puritans, as both sought to find freedom from the Anglican and Catholic churches by going to North America. The Pilgrims, as well as the Puritans, pushed very early ideals of the New World as a utopia and became a symbol of American exceptionalism. The common sentiment in the United States is that Pilgrims are the symbol of America as a religiously free society. Of course, this isn't entirely the case in real life. American settlers were not fans of the Puritans. We today hold this in our hatred, in our perspective on the Salem witch trials, as well as in famous novels such as The Scarlet Letter. This is not to mention the fact that the idea of the New World as a religious utopia existed well before the Mayflower actually landed on American shores. Regardless of the truth of the myths themselves, we have permanently cemented the idea of the American religious utopia together with this constructed identity. The Pilgrims were followed by a variety of other religious groups, some of my personal favorites being the Hutterites and the Shakers. With them, the literal soil of America itself became associated with religion, freedom, and expression, all of which lent themselves to the evolution of religion throughout the continent. Now, you may have heard me use the term American exceptionalism earlier. American exceptionalism is the concept that the United States of America is fundamentally superior due to its history and constitutional system. This idea was extremely strong after the Revolutionary War as well as the War of 1812, both of which became symbols of the United States' victory over colonial powers such as Britain. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. looked for expansion southwest through the Mexican-American War, using that American exceptionalism and the concept of manifest destiny to justify taking territory from the Mexican government and other local native groups. Hand in hand with these notions was the fact that North America in particular was celebrated for its variety of natural formations, which people began to call the Land of God. Many of these beautiful locations are now protected as state parks, which people trek to from all over the world, not unlike pilgrimage. This was also a factor in Christian expansion across today's United States. People began not only to find beauty and utopian ideals in the United States, but they began to want to create their own religions born from this new American culture and folk belief. In 1830, Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, which he claimed he had copied from ancient golden tablets that were divinely revealed to him. The book describes the Native Americans as descendants of Israelites, who journeyed to the Promised Land, that being America, and forgot their religion over time, recontextualizing the Puritan myth. As such, Smith establishes the Americas as a God-given land, as well as a land that holds a people which are sinful and must be reconverted to Christianity, thus justifying further colonization efforts. This happened hand in hand with the American government's encouragement of westward expansion, which allowed Mormonism to spread extremely quickly. Smith was outcast for his beliefs, but the spread of the Book of Mormon resulted in the creation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This was one of the first and most prominent instances of American exceptionalism and religion colliding to create something completely new and unique. Another unique development, Evangelicalism, really took hold in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in America. Evangelism, to say different than evangelicalism, is the idea of spreading the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus, similarly to how Christianity's spread is documented in the Bible. This practice came to be common in the early modern period, as colonial projects shipped out Christianity to a variety of native peoples, often with the additional intent of modernizing these groups. Evangelicalism is interdenominational, meaning that it is practiced by a variety of groups. However, the result of this interdenominationalism in the US has been the creation of kind of a new non-denominational blended Protestant sect with its own very unique belief system. So while it's technically a non-denominational group, you'll find very particular beliefs within that group. It's become its own religion, in a way. Now, the difficulty of describing evangelicalism as a whole is that since it is non-denominational, every church will have a bit of a different perspective and scale. Some are going to resemble a mixture of small Protestant churches, while others take the form of massive megachurches that put on events such as the Super Bowl of preaching, which I'll show a video to you now.
Would you like to kick or receive the Bible?
I will receive. Tom wins the toss, chooses to receive the Bible. Patterson back with the kick. Oh my goodness!
The main thing that brings all of these evangelicals together is the notion of affirmation in faith. As such, many evangelicals take the Bible quite literally and do not strongly entertain the idea of questioning their faith. Most have apocalyptic viewpoints, feeling that Jesus' return is nigh, and that makes the idea of questioning one's faith very dangerous. The evangelical movement in the United States began as it is known today in 1878, with the publication of William E. Blackstone's book, Jesus is Coming, which looked forward to the second coming of Jesus as a positive event that would bring peace to the world. However, the beginning of the 20th century was an incredibly bleak time, as the sinking of the Titanic and the advent of World War I indicated massive social and cultural upheaval. Evangelicals began to associate these events with Blackstone's inevitable coming of Christ, but they turned away from his positivity and towards the idea that Christ's return would herald the apocalypse. Driven by fear that more wars and tragedies would lead to mass destruction, these apocalyptic evangelicals found it more important than ever to spread the news of humanity's end. What makes evangelicalism in the US such a unique flavor is that idea from earlier of American exceptionalism. With all of these horrific events occurring, the Americans took on an us versus them mentality. The United States has always stayed on the outskirts of these events, never experiencing war on our own ground, but lending aid to the right side. American culture as an export became a value that was deeply integrated with the growing evangelical mindset. For this reason, conversely, evangelicals grew interested in ensuring that America remained a Christian country, and that American Christian culture was not being impacted by outside forces. They also began to push fundamentalist ideals in the 1920s, touting traditionalism and rebelling against many worldly technological developments. As Darwin's theory of evolution grew popular, evangelicals were concerned that it conflicted with their literal reading of the Genesis creation myth, and would contribute to the spread of liberal ideals. These individuals in particular are known as creationists, as they believe that the God created all beings as they are now, and they reject the Darwinian idea of creatures evolving over time. These evolutionary debates came to a head in the 1920s with the Scopes trial, a Supreme Court case which ruled against a teacher who was accused of teaching human evolution in his classroom, which violated a Tennessee law at the time. I do think it's notable to add to that in the Scopes trial, the teacher, Scopes, had actually incriminated himself intentionally because he wanted to create a news story out of these laws that he disagreed with. And sometime later, I believe in the 60s, the case was overturned, so that was no longer against him, as the law in Tennessee had changed. While the Scopes trial had been in the favor of the creationists, fear regarding what was being taught in public school systems encouraged evangelicals to open their own schools, which focused on fundamentalist ideals in the teaching of the Bible. The economic depression in the 1930s, followed by the onset of World War II, only further convinced these individuals that they had been correct in the coming of the apocalypse. Radicalization of evangelicals continued, adapting to the current era as time went on. We still see this today with events such as 9/11, for example. Now, creationism, or specifically young Earth creationism as a movement, didn't take hold until the 60s, when a series of Supreme Court cases that focused on removing religion from state institutions began to further threaten the notion of creationism being taught in schools. This began with the book The Genesis Flood, released in 1961, and stated that the Earth was only 6,000 years old, hence young Earth creationism, because the Earth is much younger than popular science says it is, millions, billions of years. The Genesis flood follows the story of Genesis literally to further explain how human beings and animals on Earth were created rather than having evolved. And I'll add a bit of a footnote. Though young Earth creationism existed previously to this movement, 1961 is where the distinction is the most important for our timeline, and where the distinction is also made most clear by those within the ideology. One of the most important of the aforementioned court cases was Epperson v. Arkansas in 1968, which ruled directly against the Scopes trial as a violation of the First Amendment. The issue with these court cases was not simply their contents being seen as an attack on creationism, but that it seemed to these fundamentals that the government was conspiring against their ideology. Similarly to how the Scopes trial prompted the creation of evangelical schools, young Earth creationists began to create their own educational efforts. The Ark Encounter was created by Christian apologetics ministry Answers in Genesis, which offers a variety of educational experiences ranging from a homeschooling curriculum to an activity full of publications to the Ark Encounter itself. Answers in Genesis is a very interesting group because it's not a church. That's why, ministry is kind of a loose term. But it's a nonprofit company based around a wide variety of very profitable evangelizing efforts. Answers in Genesis very helpfully features a statement of faith on their website, all statements upon which are cited by a Bible verse. So let's quickly go through and examine some of these values that best explain their worldview before we talk about the Ark itself. Number 1, scientific aspects of creation are important but secondary to the gospel. 2, they believe that there are 66 books in the Bible and that they are the written word of God, therefore being infallible. 66 is also the standard number used by most Protestant Christian groups. Number 3, Genesis 1-11 is a simple but factual presentation of actual events. So that's the entire myth of Adam and Eve, the creation of Earth, and the flood. Number 4, God created all kinds of beings. While some creatures are able to change over time through speciation, there has been no transference from one kind to the next. So humans, for example, could have changed over time, but we couldn't have actually evolved from apes, so there was always a form of humans on Earth. Number 5, it is impossible to disprove Scripture. Because they claim that Genesis was literal, this means that any and all arguments against creationism will fail. This is why, if you ever see the opportunity to do so, do not argue against the creationist. It will only reinforce their worldview that they are correct, and it will completely waste your time. Number 6. Mankind has two genders, male and female, who are, quote, distinct and complementary. That is a very gentle way of saying that relationships are meant to be male-female partnerships, and that transgender individuals are defying this distinction as created by God. They will bring this up again later as well, but I'm not going to repeat myself, so just know they're against anything LGBT. Number 7. Human life begins at conception, and abortion/assisted suicide are a crime against God. Number 8. I'll just quote this whole thing because it's a lot. The concepts of social justice, intersectionality, and critical race theory as defined in modern terminology are anti-biblical and destructive to human flourishing. I'll just let that one sit for a moment. Number 9. Parents must instruct their children on God from a young age. And notably, you have to consider the fact that Answers in Genesis is creating resources for children, such as those homeschooling materials, so this is really reinforcing kind of their products and what they want you to be teaching to your kids, not just a general view of teaching your kids about God. Number 10. All death and evils in the world are a result of man's sin. Now, that may sound like a standard Christian verbiage. However, Answers in Genesis uses this in a very interesting way to convert their followers by equating them to horrible people such as Hitler. That's something that they discuss at their other museum, the Creation Museum, a lot, and it's not the main topic for today, but they have a lot of emphasis on Hitler having been a evolutionist, and because of that, that's why he was so horrible to the Jewish people. Now, number 11. Christians must attend a church in some form. Again, this is interesting because creationism is a very specific ideology, and Answers in Genesis itself is not a church. They don't run any churches. You have to find another church that agrees with Answers in Genesis for this to work. And finally, number 12. Christ will return, all people living and dead shall be judged, and Satan, who is real, will be burnt in hell. So, just affirming the apocalypticism and the horrible coming days and the fact that you should be righteous so that you are not burnt in hell with Satan. I wouldn't want that to happen either. And, on their own, a lot of these statements don't sound out of the ordinary. But when you look at them as a whole, it really reflects some of the hard-set values that contribute to a very othered perspective. James Bealow, who has written one of the best and only anthropological books on the Ark, says it best. Creationists are a counter-public in American society because they exist at ideological, institutional, and everyday odds with a dominant public. This list is very defensive. It confronts modern values, such as abortion and queer rights, and it asserts definitively that Answers sets itself apart from our modern society that they see to be attacking their version of a good, kind of Christian, moral America. The very curious thing about American exceptionalism and fundamentalism in America in this instance is that the creator and CEO of Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, isn't from the United States at all. He's Australian. During university, in which Ham studied applied science, he felt at odds with what he had learned from the Bible and science that he was learning in his courses. He states in his book, Raising Godly Children in an Ungodly World, that he discovered the book The Genesis Flood, which he mentioned before, because he was looking for answers that would rationalize these conflicting worldviews. Just as it had radicalized many in America back in 1961, the Genesis Flood made Ham see that it was necessary to spread the teachings of creationism. He started several companies that focus on educational materials for creationists and moved to the United States to continue expanding these endeavors. Curiously, Ham met another Australian who had moved to the States for the same reason. Mark Louis, a Christian radio host, moved to the United States because he felt that Australia did not have the same religious fervor for creationism as his homeland. Now, Ham's relocation to the United States was an incredibly strategic move, knowing that generally American audiences would be more receptive to evangelical and creationist ideals than Australians. As his followers continued to grow, Ham looked to create the Creation Museum, an entire botanical garden and museum designed to prove the truth of creationism. He placed it in Florence, Kentucky, which is a quaint town just south of Cincinnati, which according to Ham is within a day's drive of 2/3 of Americans. With access to the south and placed along a major highway, the Creation Museum's out-of-the-way location forces people to take a day's journey to visit. Even more impressive than the Creation Museum is, of course, the Ark Encounter, located 30 minutes south of Florence, about halfway between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Lexington, Kentucky. After the success of the Creation Museum, Ham desired to create another attraction which would allow people to literally experience the Book of Genesis. The Creation Museum plays on this idea. It walks the guest through the Garden of Eden and through other biblical scenes, calling back to older Christian tourism traditions such as biblical panoramas. The Ark Encounter, on the other hand, is a far more lucrative concept, claiming to be a, quote, full-size Noah's Ark at about 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. In addition to that, they also say that it is the largest timber frame structure in the world. I don't know if that's true. I don't even know how I would fact check that, but that's what they say on their website. It wasn't an easy task to bring such a huge project to fruition, and I should also mention it's surrounded by a convention center, a zoo, a botanical garden, a lake, a playground, and a ton of various food vendors, including a 2-story buffet. The original press release for the Ark boasts a $150 million price tag and estimated itself to receive 1.6 million visitors in the first year alone. They had also originally wanted to create a Tower of Babel alongside the Ark, but sadly they didn't finalize their plan. I just have to hope that, for my sake, they'll finish that in the future, because I need to see a real-life Tower of Babel. And upon the announcement of the park's opening 6 years later, Ham stated that 80 million of the required 91.5 million had been raised for the Ark in total, and that they expected 16,000 guests a day, which would quickly fulfill the remaining $11.5 million that they would need to break even on their spending. These 6 years between the Ark's statement of intent and the official opening moved exponentially, with funding and progress trickling along slowly until the date of February 14th, 2014. The faithful date when children's media star Bill Nye the Science Guy debated Ken Ham at the Creation Museum. The debate itself is not much to talk about. I might do a video on it in the future, but it's rough.
This is a simple question, I suppose, but one that actually is fairly profound for all of us in our lives. What, if anything, would ever change your mind?
Well, the answer to that question is, I'm a Christian.
Nye uses fairly standard facts about Darwinism and evolution, while Ham refutes him by speaking on entirely separate terms of faith and biblical absolution. Even with a technical win for Bill Nye, he wasn't arguing on the basis of the Bible, and thus he's not going to change anybody's mind. Both sides only left more steadfast in their own values, without coming to a consensus between them. And if you want to watch the whole video, I will link that in the description, but it's a bit of a slog. Prior to the debate, news articles had circled stating that the Ark, quote, looked like it was sunk, until Bill Nye's publicity assisted in bringing a $62 million municipal bond to Ken Ham's doorstep. And I should note, considering that the final value was about $91 million, that's 2/3 of the entire required cost to build the Ark, all at once. The Ark construction began almost immediately, so that it could be ready for an opening date of 7/7, to reference the Genesis verse, quote, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered the Ark to escape the waters of the flood. So the guests, too, would enter the Ark on the 7th day. I escaped the waters of the flood, Or that is to say, I visited the Ark Encounter during the off-season in January. There couldn't have been more than 50 to 100 other guests that I saw that day around the entire park. This aspect made the park feel far larger. Spaces that normally would have been filled with people were completely empty. The parking lot alone was huge and notably a distance away from the Ark itself. There was also a parking fee, despite the fact that there was nowhere that you could actually park to avoid that fee. It's not really a walkable community. The parking attendant was extremely friendly, which was a trend that we saw continue throughout all of the staff. Almost every single one of them had a genuine attempt at starting a conversation with you, not unlike a Disney employee. From the parking lot, you walk to a ticketing booth, where my mother and I paid the extravagant price of $64.99 for each for admission, or $72.50 each, factoring in the parking fees. We were then guided to a bus that drove half a mile or so up a hill to the actual site of the Ark. There were a surprising amount of steps before arriving at the Ark Museum. I was well aware of the various entertainment aspects of the park, but it didn't really, dawn on me until we arrived that it was a theme park. On the bus ride, you can see the zip lines spanning across lines of trees, and more buildings become clear around the Ark itself as you approach. The bus drops off guests at a building called the Answers Center, which is a conference space with a coffee shop, a huge bookstore, and a massive theater. But we moved on from the Answers Center, and we were presented with a long promenade to the Ark with a big lake in the middle. Behind us, there was a big rainbow arch, which is apparently part of Answers in Genesis creator Ken Ham's mission to, quote, reclaim the rainbow. You can guess from who he is reclaiming it. As we began our walk to the Ark itself, I noticed the music. That's capital M, music. It's this incredibly loud, ethereal backing track with a woman vocalizing, mystical harmonies, and a vaguely Orientalist Middle Eastern sound, kind of Egyptian. You know what I'm talking about. The music plays on loop everywhere you go throughout the park, including the bathrooms. I'm not sure if it's intentional or not, but the music actually serves to drown out the speaking of those around you. My mom was actually the one to point this out. We were making a conscious effort to listen to other guests and their interpretations of the exhibits, for research, of course. We weren't just eavesdropping, wouldn't do that. But she noticed that all words beyond a couple feet away became entirely muddled into this singing. The walkway to the Ark's entrance is rather plain, but there were a couple small bird exhibits and some Assyrian-styled carved rocks that told pictographic biblical stories. But to be frank, I couldn't understand them at all without the explanation plaques provided, so they just kind of looked cool without really doing anything else. The styling of them also really confused me. The Ark ultimately struggles with deciding what cultures to draw influence from because it's under the assumption that before the flood, the Earth's continents were instead a supercontinent, which broke up and rearranged during the flood. So because of this, Noah and his family are not Middle Eastern, because the Middle East wouldn't have existed at the time, but the art undoubtedly draws from a variety of cultures found surrounding the Mediterranean. Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Roman elements seem to be most prominent, though there are modern stylizations as well. I suppose this is because these groups would have had a strong influence on the Israelites in the Old Testament, but I just found it odd considering that these cultures, wouldn't have existed prior to the flood. So I do suggest that you kind of keep your eyes open for that when we're looking at some pictures of the Ark interior, which I will include lots of next. The actual entrance to the Ark is underneath the structure, despite the appearance of a large walkway to the Ark's big doors. The queue is huge, as long or longer than popular rides at Disney World. We asked one of the workers how many people could fit in the line, and her answer was maybe 1,000? And I thought she was exaggerating at first, but after seeing this queue from other angles, and also having gone back on another occasion when it was more busy, I don't think that's implausible at all. But luckily for us, the park was nearly empty and we were able to walk right in without waiting. Another barrier to entry is a photo station at the actual doors to the Ark, which required us to take a picture before we could walk in. We didn't buy a print, but my face is now somewhere out there in the Ark Encounter cloud files, so see if that comes back to bite me someday. It took us around 45 minutes to get from the entrance of the park to the Ark itself, just because there were so many things to see. When we finally got inside, the experience was completely overwhelming. This is completely by design, it's intentional. You're in a small space filled with animal cages, barrels, vases, loud animal sounds, and there are waves crashing that are piped into the ship through speakers. I hate these sort of settings and I found it completely abrasive, but I did appreciate the effort that was put into creating the feeling of being on the Ark when it would have been completely filled. The Ark Encounter is so well designed, at least artistically speaking, that it's almost impossible not to enjoy yourself, regardless of your religious belief. As a full disclaimer, I'm not particularly religious in any way, nor do I associate with young Earth creationism in any way, but I was thoroughly impressed with the pure love that was put into every aspect of the structure. From other videos and news I had seen about this place, I was under the impression that it would just be a crappy, hokey museum, but there is genuinely something to admire here, and it would be a shame to not discuss that fact at all just because I hold different beliefs. This packed animal room is pretty small and just really is an area to set the mood. Despite how well the mood is captured, I kept noticing signs advertising, quote, Noah's flood of drinks next to the displays. From there, you move into the main body of the ship, which is a long hallway with ramps that curl all the way to the third floor. Each floor is themed a little differently. The first floor has animal cages with models of animals inside, some being dinosaurs or even extinct species. I took one Gen Ed class on dinosaurs, and I'm not an expert, but the interpretation of some of these creatures is really quite silly. Ultimately, there's not a lot to say about this area, it's just models of animals and some explanations about the logic of the Ark. The ramps between floors are placed in a center atrium, which allows you to look all the way upwards to a structure of a skylight. The second floor begins with an exhibit on the, quote, pre-flood world. This exhibit goes through some digital paintings of Adam and Eve's story. There are also several miniature models of various sinful activities that were carried out by cultures before the flood. My favorite one is a dinosaur fighting in a Roman Colosseum. There's also depictions of sacrifice to snake gods and gambling with scantily dressed women. Exiting this exhibit leaves you at the front of the ship, the angled bow of which has been turned into a moving screening area that constantly loops bizarre propaganda films. I've been trying to keep this explanation pretty unbiased, but I have no other way to describe these, and I should go on a bit of a tangent. I watched the entirety of one of these films titled In the Days of Noah, which was about this atheist news reporter who goes to the Ark Encounter to perform a disparaging interview, and instead she becomes enamored with the Ark and she converts to Christianity.
This guy better not be late.
Why? Got somewhere to go?
Yeah. As soon as possible. Alright, now let's do this. What is that? What's supposed to elaborate on Florida?
It's a ship. Look, actually, it's a full-scale reproduction of Noah's Ark.
Listen, Noah. I've never been into this kind of thing, you know that. But I was just wondering, what if someone like me wanted to get on the right side of God? If God even exists. Is that still possible?
What would your granddaddy have said?
I also watched a minute or two of the Noah interview, which is about a caricature of a tribal woman who was interviewing Noah about why he was building the Ark. I'm only now realizing that both of these films are about interviews, which is a weird coincidence. Anyway, the most obvious purpose of these is to paint atheists in an extremely mean-spirited light while portraying the conversion to Christianity as an inevitably involved part of becoming a good person. And this is perhaps the most obvious piece of conversion material in the Ark Encounter, while the rest of the park chooses to be a little more subtle in tone. After this is a room called Kids' Spooky Animal Encounters, which I didn't really get.
It's a mirror. Oh. You can't make this face in the mirror. How is this spooky?
It's kind of a dark hallway that you walk through, and you can see some little animal silhouettes running around and making sounds. There's some informal exhibits after this, which discuss basic applications of creationist logic in regard to the Ark as well. While the creationists are against evolution, they support the idea that animals can change over time, specifically within their own kind, as design features from God. They differentiate this from the biblical creationist model and refer to Darwinistic evolution as naturalistic evolutionary model. This would allow Noah to take only one species of each kind of animal onto the Ark, which would then diversify after they got off the Ark into the animals that we know today. So for example, he can take like a wolf with him, and from the wolf you get a wolf and a dog. But beyond that, you're not going to get any other evolution. There's also some discussion about how the animals were cared for in the Ark, such as their cage and feeding systems. Now, next up is my absolute favorite exhibit in the entire Ark Encounter, called the Fairy Tale Ark, which demonizes toys and children's books that depict the Ark in a cute way. The exhibit is filled with children's books, next to which apocalyptic wording is placed that warns of the allure of these books, who downplay the flood and distract us from the imminence of the end of the world. My jaw literally dropped. I was like this the whole time. Meanwhile, while it is realistically styled, the Ark Encounter is a tourist attraction. Tons of kids exhibits. It has models of animal, it has a zoo with petting, it has gift shops. It's incredibly hypocritical, even if the Ark stays away from bright colors and cuteness. Between all of these exhibits are animal cages with depictions of Noah's family taking care of them. Notably, there's only one instance of each family member throughout the Ark, and that's meant to make the audience feel more immersed in the actual story, like they are among Noah and his family, rather than just seeing depictions of Noah and his family. The next thing that you see is a large door with a cross projected in light, which is the entrance to the Ark that the animals would have walked in on. Apparently it does open, but it's kept closed and is largely just used for photo ops. And right next to this door is a large gift shop with luxury artisanal goods, such as real paintings and handmade clothing. Before we went to the third floor, I went to the bathroom. I don't have much to say about that part, but it did have a lot of Bible quotes about womanhood on the walls. And on the way out of the bathroom, a worker who had greeted me earlier said that she was glad to see me again. It was such a weird interaction that it made me feel like all of my interactions were being closely watched. It wasn't a particularly busy day, so I'm sure that all the employees really could keep track of me, but this just completely caught me off guard. But I just smiled and I nodded and I headed up the ramp to the third and final floor. The third floor starts with a depiction of Noah's living quarters, with more details on the lives of Noah's children and their wives. This section is probably some of the strongest artistic license that's taken, as it creates entirely new characters for the wives, and they're not mentioned, really at all in Genesis.
Why don't I look 600? What do you mean? I look about the same age as any other 600-year-old person I've met. Well, except for my wife, of course. She doesn't look a day past 400.
If you say so, dear.
Imzara's still as beautiful as she was on our wedding day.
The Ark Encounter posits that each of the wives was of a different skin tone, and that's what resulted in the various different skin tones that we have today. While Noah and his sons were all vaguely Caucasian, light, Middle Eastern, olive-y skin tone. While Noah would have had to pick 2 of each animal, was God specifically choosing these wives with the explicit purpose of racial diversity? I don't think this idea is necessarily in conflict with mainstream Christian interpretations of the flood, but it certainly made me consider this aspect more than I had before. The following exhibits on the 3rd floor focus on scientific aspects of the flood. I'll quickly summarize them because there's a whole lot. Flood geology discusses Pangea, which young Earth creationists believe both formed and broke apart during the flood, so that the world was reformed entirely by the time that Noah left the Ark. The Ice Age exhibit uses an example of World War II planes lost in Greenland and rediscovered 40 years later to disprove ice layers being used to date the Earth. The Babel exhibit is pretty straightforward. It explains the origin of language and the Tower of Babel. I also wanted to add that this exhibit implies that the existence of ancient tower structures around the world proves the Tower of Babel myth, and it has a weird shoehorned section that states repeatedly that the Bible doesn't condone racism. This feels like a very specific reaction to far-right Christianity, as that is the crowd that Andress and Genesis is catering to, and that those are the opinions that they're echoing, especially with like the anti-LGBTQ stuff. It feels like a very pointed choice. After this, an exhibit on ancient man states that ancient humans were intelligent rather than foolish Neanderthals like we might imagine them to be, and there's some more information on the Covenant and on Noah's Ark. At this point, it is really easy to get sick of hearing about the Ark. It really blends together and museum fatigue sets in fast. Luckily, the final exhibits of the Ark discuss some miscellaneous topics and are far less directly informational, which does help the viewer a lot. The penultimate exhibit is Voyage of a Book, a collaboration with the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. that discusses how missionaries spread the Bible across the world. I found this exhibit incredibly disappointing and just completely lacking in information. This really surprised me. I've been to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., and, it's not perfect, but it is really informative and a lot less biased than I had expected when I went. But this exhibit focuses on stories of individuals such as Frumentius, Miles Coverdale, Hudson Taylor, but it only gives them a paragraph each and features 2 to 3 vaguely related artifacts, most of which are just facsimile or similar to the original. So, I don't know. This exhibit just irked me. It also completely glosses over a lot of the Protestant Reformation and leaves out a lot of context behind settling native groups as Christians. Despite my disappointment, I trudged on to Searching for Truth, which is actually the largest single exhibit in the Ark Encounter. It's less of an exhibit and more of an art installation of comic panels that are directly aimed at young adults who are questioning their religious identity. It tells the story of a girl who goes to a college religious studies course and starts questioning her friend's Christianity because the professor is pointing out so many errors and inconsistencies in the Bible. I should add that I was delighted, as a religious studies student, to have been demonized in one of these exhibits, and I was trying really hard not to laugh out loud in front of the docents. The story goes on to have the friend proselytize to his friends until eventually the main girl gets into a car accident and converts, among some other things. They also have this friend who remains atheist until the end of the story, and he walks sadly off into the sunset. But now that we had seen everything on the upper decks, we had to walk all the way down the ramps again to the very bottom of the ship to get to the exit gift shop. You may recall my favorite exhibit, the Fairy Tale Ark, that really warned against depicting the Ark in a cute manner. The gift shop really took the cake. There were all sorts of stuffed animal plushies, which are of course marketed as the animals of Noah's Ark, as well as miniature arks, Christmas ornaments, name tags, and all sorts of other tacky gift shop items that are sold for exorbitant prices. I was really blown away by the gall to be so heavily against cute interpretations of the Ark. Meanwhile, I could not say a single thing in that gift shop carried the emotional weight of the apocalypse, as they claimed the Ark needed to. Anyway, I got a sticker. And on a later visit to the Creation Museum, I got these Ark Edition playing cards. Upon leaving the gift shop, you are immediately greeted with a buffet, strategically placed to entice children who are hungry after lots of walking. I very politely asked my mother if we could go, but she said no, and I found that very detrimental to my research. Some quick online searching seems to show that it just serves standard American fare. I found that very disappointing. I was hoping for, like, biblically themed food or something, but it's just mac and cheese and hot dogs. Behind the Ark is a fairly large botanical garden and zoo. The 2 times that I went to the Ark were in different seasons. In the winter, the animals were kept inside covered enclosures that looked too small and had very little enrichment, so that was pretty sad. I hope that maybe there were just more private areas for the animals that I couldn't see, but it really didn't appear like it from the actual size of the buildings that the animals had a lot of space to roam indoors. They had 5 or so kangaroos in a long room, and it had a couple toys and hay that was just strewn about the floor kind of randomly. And it didn't seem right, but I'm not an animal care expert, so I can't really comment on that. In the summer, the zoo is a lot more pleasant. It's hard not to like this section, though there were a couple of signs scattered around that preached against global warming, and that caught me very off guard. And they also offer camel rides, yay! On the walk back to the front of the park, you pass a lot of little food stands, playground areas, and mostly kid-centered attractions. During the winter, it was impossible to tell that this stuff was even there, because it was just completely covered in snow. But luckily during the summer, everything was accessible, so we could get a good look. There are 2 indoor attractions as you leave as well, which are a carousel and a VR experience. Unfortunately, I didn't want to wait in line with children for the carousel, or pay exorbitant amounts of money to watch a VR movie about Noah, so I didn't do that. But there is one final experience that I had at the Ark that I will share. I mentioned at the very beginning of the story that the Answer Center has a large conference space and hosts plays. While I didn't go to a play on my first visit, I decided to on my second. The play was called Hold Fast and was put on by students of Bob Jones University, which is an evangelical Christian university in South Carolina. My boyfriend and I were immediately drawn in by the giant hammer and sickle logo on posters and its vague description as a true story about Russian history. I'm sure I could make an entirely separate essay on this play alone, so I'll just summarize by saying it paints the Russian Revolution and communism as an attack on Christianity and nothing else. And to be clear, the Bolsheviks did target Christians, and they did some really horrific things. But this play took incredible leaps through logic. I felt terrible. There were maybe 10 people total watching the play in this giant theater. It was huge, and I was covering my mouth to keep from laughing. Maybe I'm just a really bad ethnographer. But, the ending became a sermon, with one woman turning to the crowd and proclaiming the word of Jesus in a several-minute-long monologue. This conclusion was essentially a celebration of Christian martyrdom, an aspect of Christianity that is generally removed from Protestantism, but is used by some fundamentalist evangelicals to support apocalypticism. I won't get into specifics, but there was also, a recent assassination of a political figure that I think has also been used by the evangelicals in a very similar manner. This play, in many ways, sums up what the Ark Encounter does. It presents itself as a grounded history, but massively exaggerates details until it's no longer history or even scripture, but a sermon. So, what's the point of the whole thing? The Ark's a museum, as well as a theme park, an American tourist attraction, and an evangelizing effort. We've engaged with the context for why the Ark Encounter exists, as well as what the Ark really entails. So now let's dive headfirst into how the Ark Encounter operates and how it impacts us within today's society. A lot of what we're going to discuss will sound negative or critical, so let's start with something a little lighter. The Ark as a museum is a genuine feat of artistry, which is something that I have to acknowledge despite my personal differences with it. The actual construction of the whole campus forces you to have a sense of awe, as you take the bus and then have to walk a good deal further to arrive at the actual building. It has those skylights running through every floor to give the impression of how light may have entered the real Ark, and there's a generally ancient Near East theme throughout all the signage, which I mentioned earlier, but it borders all of the signs with these really lovely carved wood patterns. I should also mention that all of the signage is written in present tense rather than past tense, which also serves to let the viewer immerse themselves within the Ark experience as a present experience rather than a past recreation. Every part of the Ark manages to look handmade, which is shocking for a structure of this size. The actual models of the ship are very thoughtfully made, and while the dinosaurs are silly looking, they're quite well constructed. In this way, the Ark achieves two of its major goals, which is to, quote, transport viewers somewhere else, and to create, quote, immersive play in the creationist past, according to the creative team behind the project anyway. The Ark also doesn't require any background knowledge. The entire creation myth is explained right away, which lowers the barrier of entry to a much wider audience. This is also part of the Ark's proselytizing efforts, as it introduces the creation myth of Genesis from a blank slate that refreshes followers as well as doubters and atheists who might not know anything about the subject. An unfortunate downside of the Ark Encounter is that it is a high-volume attraction, and the sheer number of people who visit can detract from the experience. I've visited the Ark twice, once during the off-season with maybe 100 visitors, and once during the peak summer season in June. At full capacity, the Ark is not enjoyable. The open format of the Ark means that there's no clear flow of people, and a lack of large seating areas results in the few benches being surrounded by large families or church groups who are trying to get all of their things together. The positioning of those benches also tends to be in the few open areas at the far ends of the ship, and this results in an extremely claustrophobic and often congested space. An additional issue with the actual construction of the Ark is that the exhibits are attached to long hallways that form the sides of the ship. Sometimes these exhibits form hallways themselves, but more often than not, they are square rooms with 3 walls that you walk directly into and then out of from that hallway. These also prove to be strong points of congestion, as there are a lot of signs with a lot of text, and many of the people here are going to be interested in reading every single sign. So you would get families and church groups who would clog up the exhibits for upwards of 10 minutes at a time.
Yeah, so everyone ends up sitting in these areas for a really long time.
And that's further disrupting flow, as this would force guests to come back to the exhibits they missed later, and to do this they would double back on themselves rather than following the kind of clockwise fashion that you're meant to walk in. Unfortunately, all of this comes down to the fact that the Ark Encounter is laid out in a realistic format rather than a traditional museum. It's very fun conceptually, and as an empty space, it's great, but unfortunately for the wide loads of people that it's meant to hold, its hallways and ovular shape result in more harm than good. Now, Andress and Genesis's other museum, the Creation Museum, doesn't really have this problem, so this is more likely an issue with the core concept of the Ark Encounter rather than the actual ability of the creative team to lay out their museum properly. While the Ark Encounter attempts to create an ancient space, its aesthetic choices of the structure are strikingly modern. To begin with, the Ark's placement in the United States draws upon the ritual of the American road trip. Is traveling to this museum really just a day's journey, or is it in its own way a religious pilgrimage? Despite being a largely secular nation, the United States has a rich history of civil religion, or specific practices that form the traditions and culture of a group of people without being strictly religious, as we would like to think of it. These are things we do without thinking twice, like watching football on Sundays or taking part in the Pledge of Allegiance. The road trip has always been a part of American civil religion for about as long as the highway system has existed. Route 66, developed in the mid-1920s, is probably the most famous in road tripping history. It went from a dark and foreboding path in the Grapes of Wrath to a symbol of prosperity in the years after World War II. And so the feeling of traveling Route 66 has always mattered as much, if not more, than the destination itself. And that's a lot like those ancient traditions of pilgrimage that we saw in the medieval times. Additionally, it's impossible to know where the Ark was originally built. While most assume that the Ark would have been built in the Near East or Asia Minor, Andress in Genesis asserts that the world before the flood was entirely different, right? It was one supercontinent, this was called Rodinia, and during the flood those pieces came apart and became Pangaea. This allows us to reasonably assume that America's soil would have been the location for the Ark, and it lets us take down mental barriers that might stand in the way of our experience role-playing in the Ark. Now, one of the Ark's most surprising aspects is its price point. Or perhaps it isn't surprising for a theme park, but going into it, I was just shocked at how much everything cost. And given that it's marketed as a religious experience, you would expect it to have a lower barrier of entry for most people. If you want to do every single thing at the Ark Encounter, the total price would range from a minimum of $225 to a maximum of $375, depending on what tier of experience you're paying for. That price includes, and I just have to read this straight off my board because I can't memorize this, $64.99 admission, $16.50 for the Truth Traveler Flood of Reality virtual reality experience, $59 to $144 for the zipline, $40 to $60 for behind-the-scenes animal experiences, $10 for a camel ride, $5 for a camel encounter, which includes 3 pieces of lettuce, $20 for Mzara's Buffet, which is the main restaurant, and $10 to $55 for mining sluice. I think that's like one of those little kids' activities where you sift through dirt and rocks, and you get some little crystals in there. And all of that is not including the 3 separate gift shops, smaller food stands, parking, gas, coffee for tired parents. And if you're coming from afar, you're also going to need to factor in hotel costs and multiple days of passes. When I visited the Ark Encounter, I didn't have a specific idea in mind, nor did I expect it to be a true theme park. But when we first arrived and I saw the prices and the gift shops and the food offerings and everything else, I quickly realized this was far less of a biblical experience than it was made out to be. Even in James Belo's book about the making of the Ark Encounter, the perspective that Belo hears from the entire creative team is almost that of an art installation. There seems to be a strong disconnect between the intended audience of the Ark Encounter and the lived experience of the Ark Encounter. At the same time, though, I could be completely wrong about that. Because I'm an outsider, I don't view the Ark in the same way that someone who is deeply ingrained in this belief system would. The families around us seemed to all love the park, and it had a variety of experiences that would keep the whole family occupied. But for me, I guess as a very deeply cynical person, I found the Ark Encounter to be extremely off-putting because of that fact. One of my biggest questions when I went to the Ark Encounter was, who is this for? The massive media reaction to it, framing it as absurd and ridiculous, shows that I'm not the only person with this thought. If we look at the age range, the Ark is styled as a theme park with a variety of activities specifically to attract families and young children. There's that large parking lot with special bus parking, and there's a hotel directly next door to it. And that encourages families and church groups to make the Ark Encounter their big vacation destination. Bill Nye commented during his visit to the completed Ark Encounter on the fact that many of the guests he saw were school children, and expressed concern that this was an age range that can't distinguish between the narratives they are being given. The gift shops are also rather telling, filled with stuffed animals, stickers, candy, but it's not the kids coming alone, it's also the parents who are bringing them. There's a couple possible groups that we need to consider theologically as audiences of the Ark. Creationist Christians, non-creationist Christians, non-Christian spiritualists, and skeptic agnostics and atheists. For creationists, the poll is clear. Because the United States is so removed from ancient Christian history, the Ark is building biblical space in a curated, accessible format. But while it is transporting this biblical history to the present, we also need to keep in mind that it serves the unique role of being one of the only biblical remnants that will directly affirm evangelical and creationist values. It also serves as an alternative for the whole family, with an easy-to-understand narrative and a fenced-in theme park setting that provides a more curated experience than one might find when they're confronted with some of the realities of places such as the West Bank and Jerusalem. Notably, despite knowing the fact that the core of people visiting and actually spending money at the Ark Encounter would be other creationists, they occupied the creative team's attention least of all. Non-creationist Christians are also drawn to the Ark through their interest in experiencing the Bible. This particularly goes for evangelical Christians and other Christian sects that encourage a more literal interpretation of the Bible. Even if they disagree that the earth is 7,000 years old, they may still believe in the story of the Ark and the flood. In telling people about my research, I actually met a lot of people who said they wanted to visit the Ark Encounter someday. And then they were genuinely surprised when I mentioned that it was a creationist conversion effort. I don't blame them either. The marketing for the Ark is simple, family-friendly, and at times cheeky with its wording. It's a biblical experience, but what that really means is vastly different for a creationist, literalist, or atheist. Non-Christian spiritualists, agnostics, and atheists are all meant to be drawn to the Ark out of curiosity. They may not believe in the idea, but they see the educational vibe and the majesty of the Ark itself and may choose it for a day's vacation. The semi-biblical aspects of the park should be especially attractive to these individuals, such as the botanical garden and zoo, and the Ark Museum is really meant to potentially spark a greater interest in the Bible and creationism. For the Ark's creative team, a major goal was to make the Ark such an experience, or perhaps an encounter, an Ark encounter, that non-Christians and non-creationists would consider conversion more seriously. There is a major caveat with this goal. The Ark Encounters team is creationist. When they attempted to preempt and challenge possible objections to, their museum, they failed to consider, or at least were unable to reconcile with, the fact that atheists and even most Christians don't read the Bible literally. The basis of many creationist arguments lies in the fact that the Bible is inerrant, or the literal word of God. To convert a non-believer to this perspective is extremely difficult, especially when a non-believer visiting the Ark Encounter will likely be going with the strict purpose of critiquing the Ark's message. Much of the Ark's conversion effort lies in apocalyptic rhetoric, which pushes the notion of religious authority rather than the authority of history and science. The Ark Encounter constantly reminds the viewer that the end is coming. The entire flood narrative of the Ark is being presented to us for the precise purpose of reminding us that the flood will happen again, and that only the righteous will be saved. This fear of the coming apocalypse is meant to spur belief and evangelization, but this falls flat for any non-Christian without the biblical basis for which it comes from. We also need to consider the historical implications of these apocalyptic ideas. Often, apocalypticism was meant to explain horrible events, such as the Titanic, as we discussed previously. In the Jewish world of the Old Testament, apocalypticism was meant to explain constant subjugation from empires, such as the Babylonians. While horrible things are obviously still happening in the world today, and some Christians do use that to justify the coming apocalypse, atheists are unlikely to attribute their feelings of helplessness in the world to religion and sin. The definitions of what we consider to be an omen of societal collapse differ based on our religious backgrounds. While the Ark uses the fact that many people have moved away from religion as one of those signs of the apocalypse, if you're an atheist, that's not going to bother you at all, because you're already one of those people. Emma Bloomfield, in her article Ark Encounter as Material Apocalyptic Rhetoric, describes an experience that I want to include in full as a big quote. While reading this poster, a woman next to me exclaimed, "Oh, that's how he did it." Although visitors likely already believe in the Bible, the act of viewing, seeing, and being immersed in the Ark provides material justification for their belief. I particularly enjoy this line because I recall hearing very similar things, though unfortunately I didn't know any of them specifically during my visits. The word justification that Bloomfield uses is especially important because it implies a justification for an already held belief, rather than proof or evidence that would cause one to adopt a new belief. While the Ark perhaps fails its goal of converting non-believers, it does an excellent job at reconverting those who may have left Answers in Genesis's specific flavor of evangelical Christianity. Its existence brings in those from outside its regular sphere of influence regularly, and families or church groups who may visit might also drag along those who are on the very edges of faith, and they might just want to have a fun day in a theme park. The frightening messaging is perfect for those who may have once believed or who are just falling out of the belief system. The Ark Encounter shames those who question their apocalyptic ideas by repeatedly stating that you must be firm in your faith in order to not succumb to the same horrors as the rest of the world did during the flood. The aspects of roleplay that the Ark uses further one's personal acceptance of this messaging as well. When you enter the Ark, you become part of the story. You are told that the world outside the Ark is evil and desolate, and that those within the Ark are saved. That extends beyond literal ramifications of that idea to the actual followers of answers in Genesis and to the ones who are within the Ark instead of outside of it. The aspects of roleplay that the Ark uses further one's personal acceptance of this messaging as well. When you enter the Ark, you become part of the story. You are told that the world outside the Ark is evil and desolate, and that those within the Ark are saved. That extends beyond the literal ramifications of that idea, and it extends to the followers of Answers in Genesis. Material justification isn't just in the words in various exhibits, but it's in the actual makeup of the attraction. And this is why there are multiple sections of the experience that are dedicated to explaining how the Ark Encounter was made, where the research came from, and its historical authenticity. These encourage the audience to think critically about the possibility of Noah's Ark, and of course all of the theological implications and apocalypticism that go along with it. The Ark Encounter isn't just preaching about the apocalypse, though. It has strong political, societal, and cultural messages that are hidden just under the surface. Once the audience adopts Answers in Genesis' narrative about the flood, they also have to reckon with what that means for our society today. Let's think about the structure of the Ark as a museum again. The Ark Encounter Museum begins historically focused, with displays of animals and demonstrations of what Noah's life would have been like through those exhibits such as Animal Kinds and the Half-Ark model. As the parkgoer progresses through exhibits, the amount of apocalyptic rhetoric increases through depictions of life before the flood. These depictions focus on sins such as gambling, false idols, and pleasures of the flesh. Then, the more scientific exhibits that explain the proof behind young Earth creationism imply that large government entities who have performed geological research are not to be trusted. This is also when we see some more realistic evidence used, from diagrams to actual fossils. Towards the end of the Ark Encounter, an exhibit on the history of the Bible, Voyage of the Book, discusses Christian missionary work while leaving out the historical context of Protestant movements. This exhibit portrays Native American groups and non-Western civilizations as convertible and happy to accept the Word of God. Then, when you walk into the Can We Trust the Bible exhibit, and that shows the story of the young woman in college, and college is scandalous and dangerous, the woman is converted when she realizes how scary the world around her is without faith. All of this builds up to the gift shop at the end of the Ark Encounter building. There's a shelf in this gift shop that is entirely dedicated to political pamphlets discussing hot topic issues. They are fairly short, inflammatory, and they immediately tell the viewer about something sinful that they need to avoid in order to remain pure. Some examples on the Answers in Genesis website include God's word on, quote, gay marriage. Doesn't carbon dating disprove the Bible? And millions of years, and the downfall of the Christian West. And there are many more on topics such as transgenderedness, Islam, and abortion. The abortion one I actually have right here. I took like 5 of those pamphlets because they were just giving them out for free. Right next to this display are even more homeschooling tools and books for children. The idea with these is that after a parent goes through the Ark Encounter and witnesses the horror of sin, they'll want to protect their child from non-creationist public school education by giving them a variety of curated homeschool material. On the Answers in Genesis website, you can actually even sort by age group when you're looking in the category Witnessing Tools, so that you can target any desired demographic. While it might seem absurd or even funny, the Ark Encounter creates a slippery slope into their political perspective. Even after I went, I didn't consider a lot of this stuff until I began to work on this project and thought about how everything was actually working together. And if you think about a guest who goes to the Ark Encounter who already shares many of those extreme viewpoints prior to visiting, imagine how going to the Ark and receiving material justification, as Bloomfield puts it, might even radicalize those people further and give them more justification for their beliefs. The political, societal, and cultural implications of the Ark Encounter reveal a sobering truth under the surface. The Ark chooses to portray itself as a fun, family-friendly adventure, but it was truly created not just as a conversion effort to a religion, but to an entire political subculture. By creating a monument such as a life-size Noah's Ark, Answers in Genesis positions itself as the author of biblical narrative. It writes its own history that is specific to evangelicalism. It also transports the location of the Bible to the United States, despite our disconnect from ancient history. In this landscape of few true Christian experiences, the Ark Encounter serves an important role as one of the only sites for evangelicals for faith affirmation and reconversion. I hope that if nothing else, this video essay has taught you about the history of America and why we have so many of these kind of peculiar religious attractions. The Ark Encounter isn't the only one. We've had many ones in history, such as the Holy Land experience, and there's even some kind of smaller versions of the Ark Encounter. I know in Nauvoo, there's a little creationist museum. These things are all over the place. The Ark Encounter is just the biggest one, and it's the one that gets pointed at and laughed at the most. So I hope that this has opened your eyes to what the Ark Encounter really is and the way that it operates in America and how fascinating this subject can be. Even when it is, funny and kind of weird at times, it has serious implications for what's happening in the world today. And, if you liked it, you gotta like and subscribe. That's what YouTubers say. And I'm posting a YouTube video. So that's what I'm gonna say too. Thank you for watching. This is really long, so it means a lot if you did.